Behind the golden gates of Windsor Castle, where centuries of royal secrets sleep in shadows, a single photograph would shatter the carefully constructed harmony of the modern monarchy. It wasn't a scandal that would threaten the crown, nor a political crisis that would shake the nation. Instead, it was something far more personal and devastating, a family portrait that revealed the true cost of love, power, and the desperate need to belong. When Camilla Parker Bowles became queen consort, she thought her battles were over. She had weathered decades of public hatred, survived comparisons to the beloved Diana, and finally earned her place beside Charles on the throne. But acceptance from the British people was one thing. Acceptance from the royal family was quite another. And Princess Anne, with her sharp tongue and unforgiving memory, had never forgotten the pain her brother endured during his first marriage. The portrait in question wasn't meant for public eyes. It was a private family photograph, taken during a quiet Sunday afternoon at Balmoral, showing 4 generations of royals gathered in the drawing room. Charles sat in the center, flanked by his children and grandchildren, with Anne standing proudly behind him, the devoted sister who had always been his strongest supporter. It should have been a moment of unity, a symbol of the family's strength after years of turmoil. But Camilla saw something different in that photograph. She saw herself erased, cropped out as if she had never existed, as if her years of service and sacrifice meant nothing. The realization would set in motion a chain of events that would test the bonds of blood, loyalty, and love in ways the royal family had never experienced before. This is the story of how a simple act of editing a family photograph exposed the deepest wounds within the House of Windsor, and how King Charles III was forced to choose between a woman he loved and a sister who had always stood by his side. The morning sunlight filtered through the tall windows of Clarence House, casting long shadows across the Persian carpets that had witnessed decades of royal secrets. Queen Consort Camilla sat at her mahogany desk, surrounded by correspondence that required her attention. The transition from Duchess to Queen Consort had brought with it a mountain of new responsibilities, each one carefully orchestrated by the palace staff who had served the monarchy for generations. She reached for her reading glasses, a simple pair that Charles had once joked made her look distinguished, though she knew he was being kind. At 75, Camilla had learned to embrace the changes that time brought, both to her appearance and her role within the royal family. The woman who had once been vilified by the British press now found herself in a position she had never truly expected to occupy, despite decades of preparation. The envelope that would change everything arrived with the afternoon post, delivered by her private secretary, along with the usual assortment of invitations, charity requests, and official documents. It was cream-colored paper, expensive and thick, with her name written in Anne's unmistakable handwriting across the front. Princess Anne had always prided herself on maintaining the old traditions, including the lost art of personal correspondence. Camilla opened the envelope with the silver letter opener that had been a wedding gift from Charles, its handle engraved with their intertwined initials. Inside was a single photograph, accompanied by a brief note written on Anne's personal letterhead. The photograph showed the royal family gathered in the drawing room at Balmoral during their last visit, a candid moment captured by one of Anne's staff members. The image was beautiful in its simplicity. Charles sat in the center of the group, looking relaxed in a way that only happened when he was surrounded by family. William and Catherine flanked him on one side, their children scattered around them with the casual ease of youth. Harry stood slightly apart, as he often did these days, but his smile was genuine as he watched his nephews play. Anne stood behind Charles, her hand resting protectively on his shoulder, the gesture of a sister who had always been his fiercest defender. But something was wrong with the picture. Camilla stared at it for several minutes before the realization hit her like a physical blow. She wasn't in the photograph at all. She remembered the moment clearly. She had been standing beside Charles, had felt the warmth of his hand as he reached for hers during the informal pose. Yet in this version, the space where she should have been was seamlessly filled by a rearrangement of the other family members. The note from Anne was brief and to the point, as all her communications tended to be. Camilla, I thought you might like to see this lovely family photograph from our last gathering at Balmoral. I've had copies made for everyone and plan to display it in the gallery at Gatcombe Park. Such a wonderful representation of our family unity. Best regards, Anne. Camilla set the photograph down with trembling hands. The message was clear, even if it was wrapped in the polite language of royal correspondence. Anne had deliberately edited her out of the family portrait, creating a version of reality where she simply didn't exist. The technical skill required to make such an edit seamlessly was impressive, but the intent behind it was devastating. She walked to the window, looking out at the London street where tourists often gathered, hoping for a glimpse of royal life. They saw the pageantry and ceremony, the beautiful gowns and glittering tiaras, But they couldn't see moments like this, moments when the human cost of belonging to the most famous family in the world became painfully clear. The relationship between Camilla and Anne had always been complicated. In the early days of her relationship with Charles, Anne had been coolly polite but distant. She had watched her brother's first marriage crumble, had seen the pain in his eyes during those difficult years, and she had never fully forgiven the woman she held responsible for that turmoil. That Camilla had also suffered during those years, that she had endured decades of public hatred and media scrutiny, seemed to matter less to Anne than the loyalty she felt toward her brother. Over the years, they had found a way to coexist. Anne was unfailingly correct in her behavior toward Camilla, never openly hostile but never truly warm either. They worked together at royal events, exchanged pleasantries at family gatherings, and maintained the facade of family harmony that the monarchy required. But beneath the surface, tension simmered. Anne had never forgotten the chaos of the 1990s, when the royal family had faced one crisis after another. The divorce, the scandals, the death of Diana, all of it had been played out in the harsh glare of media attention. As the Princess Royal, Anne had a strong sense of duty and an even stronger sense of protecting the institution of monarchy. In her mind, Camilla would always be the outsider who had disrupted that stability. The photograph represented something deeper than a simple family moment. It was Anne's way of asserting her vision of what the royal family should be, a vision that apparently didn't include Camilla, even now that she wore the crown. The technical precision of the edit suggested that this hadn't been a spontaneous decision. Anne had commissioned this work, had taken time to ensure it was done professionally, and had then sent copies to the entire family. Camilla wondered how Charles would react when he saw his copy. Would he notice immediately that she was missing, or would it take him a moment to realize what Anne had done? She imagined William and Catherine looking at their copy, perhaps confused about where Camilla had been standing that day. The thought of her stepchildren seeing this edited version of their family history was particularly painful. The afternoon stretched on, and Camilla found herself unable to concentrate on any of her other correspondence. She kept returning to the photograph, studying the faces of her family members, looking for any sign that they had noticed her absence during what must have been a coordinated photo session. The more she looked, the more isolated she felt. When Charles returned from his appointments that evening, Camilla was still sitting at her desk, the photograph placed prominently where he couldn't miss it. He entered the room with his usual energy, already talking about his day and the various meetings he had attended. It wasn't until he approached her desk to give her his customary kiss on the cheek that he saw the photograph. The silence that followed was deafening. Charles picked up the image, studying it with the same intensity that Camilla had shown hours earlier. She watched his face as understanding dawned, saw the moment when he realized what his sister had done. His expression shifted from confusion to hurt to anger in the space of a few seconds. "Where did this come from?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled in the way it became when he was trying not to lose his temper. "Anne sent it this afternoon," Camilla replied quietly. She mentioned having copies made for everyone and planning to display it at Gatcombe Park. Charles set the photograph down and walked to the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture she had learned to recognize as a sign of deep thought. The room was quiet, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock that had belonged to his grandmother. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of sadness that broke her heart. "I'm so sorry, my darling," he said without turning around. "This is unacceptable, and I will speak with Anne immediately." But Camilla knew it wouldn't be that simple. Anne was not a woman who acted impulsively or without consideration. This photograph was a deliberate statement, a line drawn in the sand that would force Charles to choose between his loyalty to his sister and his love for his wife. The battle lines had been drawn, and Camilla realized that her fight for acceptance within the royal family was far from over. The evening that followed was tense, filled with quiet conversations and meaningful glances. Charles made several phone calls, his voice low but urgent as he spoke to various family members. Camilla retreated to her private sitting room, giving him space to handle the situation as he saw fit. But she couldn't shake the feeling that Anne's actions had opened a wound that would be difficult to heal. As she prepared for bed that night, Camilla caught sight of herself in the mirror. The woman looking back at her had survived decades of public scrutiny, had weathered storms that would have broken lesser people, and had finally achieved the acceptance and respect she had fought so hard to earn. Yet a single photograph had the power to make her feel like an outsider once again. The realization that her place in the royal family was still not secure, even after all these years, was perhaps the most painful part of Anne's calculated cruelty. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles to fight in the ongoing war for her rightful place in the House of Windsor. But tonight, she simply felt tired and more alone than she had in years. The grey Scottish morning matched Charles's mood as he drove through the gates of Gatcombe Park, Anne's country estate in Gloucestershire. He had called ahead, his conversation with his sister brief and formal, requesting a private meeting at her earliest convenience. Anne, never one to avoid confrontation, had simply replied that she would be expecting him. The estate spread across 730 acres of rolling countryside, a working farm that reflected Anne's practical nature and her love of horses. Charles had always admired his sister's ability to balance her royal duties with her passion for equestrian sports and agricultural life. She was, in many ways, the most grounded member of their family, completely comfortable with who she was and unburdened by the constant self-doubt that plagued him. But today, that same certainty and unwavering confidence felt more like stubbornness, and Charles found himself preparing for what would likely be one of the most difficult conversations of his life. Anne was not a woman who apologized easily or backed down from positions she believed to be correct. Their childhood had been filled with spirited debates and arguments, but this felt different. This was about more than sibling rivalry or family dynamics. This was about the very nature of what their family had become. Anne met him at the front door herself, dressed in her typical country attire of worn riding boots, comfortable trousers, and a well-used jacket that had seen countless seasons of outdoor work. Her graying hair was pulled back in a practical style that paid no attention to fashion trends, and her face bore the weathered look of someone who spent significant time outdoors. At 73, she remained remarkably fit and energetic, a testament to her active lifestyle. "Charles," she greeted him with a nod, her tone neutral but not unfriendly. "Come in. I've had Mrs. Henderson prepare tea in the morning room." They walked through the familiar corridors of the house, past walls lined with photographs of Anne's equestrian achievements and family moments spanning decades. Charles noticed several new additions to the collection, including the very photograph that had brought him here today. Seeing it displayed so prominently in a silver frame that matched the others in the collection felt like another deliberate provocation. The morning room faced east, capturing the pale autumn sunlight that filtered through windows overlooking Anne's beloved gardens. The space was comfortable rather than grand, reflecting her preference for functionality over formality. A tea service had been laid out on a low table between two worn leather chairs that had belonged to their mother. "I assume you're here about the photograph," Anne said as she settled into her chair and began pouring tea with practiced efficiency. There was no pretense of small talk or attempt to avoid the subject. It was typical Anne, direct, uncompromising, and completely unashamed of her actions. "Among other things, yes," Charles replied, accepting the cup she offered him. The ritual of afternoon tea felt absurd under the circumstances, but some habits were too deeply ingrained to abandon, even during moments of family crisis. Anne stirred her tea thoughtfully, the silver spoon clinking against the china in a steady rhythm. "I suppose Camilla found it upsetting," she said finally, her tone suggesting that she found such a reaction puzzling rather than understandable. "She found it hurtful, Anne, as did I." Charles set down his cup, the delicate china rattling slightly against the saucer. "What I don't understand is why you felt the need to edit her out of a family photograph. What possible purpose could that serve?" Anne's expression didn't change, but Charles caught a slight tightening around her eyes. "I created a photograph that accurately represented our family as I see it," she replied evenly. "Camilla may be your wife, and she may hold the title of Queen Consort, but that doesn't automatically make her family in any meaningful sense." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Charles felt his temper rising but forced himself to remain calm. Losing his composure would only give Anne ammunition for her argument that he was still too emotional when it came to Camilla, still too willing to let his heart override his judgment. "She has been part of this family for over 15 years, he said carefully. "She has carried out her royal duties with grace and dedication. She has supported me through some of the most challenging moments of my reign. How is that not meaningful?" Anne leaned back in her chair, studying her brother with the same analytical gaze she might use to evaluate a horse's conformation. "She has performed her role adequately," she conceded. "But performing a role and truly belonging are two different things. You know as well as I do that her presence in this family has always been complicated. Complicated by people who refuse to let go of the past," Charles shot back, his carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. "How long is she supposed to pay for decisions that were made decades ago? How long are you going to punish her for the fact that my first marriage failed?" Anne's laugh was sharp and humorless. "I'm not punishing anyone, Charles. I'm simply acknowledging reality. Diana was family in a way that Camilla never can be. Diana was the mother of your children, the woman who brought William and Harry into this world. She was beloved by the British people and accepted by our parents. Her death was a tragedy that affected all of us. And none of that is Camilla's fault, Charles said quietly. Diana and I were both unhappy in our marriage long before Camilla became a factor. You know that. You lived through those years. You saw what it was like for all of us. Anne stood and walked to the window, looking out at the grounds where several of her horses grazed peacefully in the morning sun. Her shoulders were straight and rigid, a physical manifestation of her unwillingness to bend on this issue. I saw what I saw, she said without turning around. I saw my brother torn apart by conflicting loyalties. I saw two young boys caught in the middle of a very public disaster. I saw our family dragged through scandal after scandal while the press had a field day with our private pain. And through it all, there was Camilla, always in the background, always part of the equation that made everything more complicated. She suffered too, Charles said, rising from his chair to face his sister. She endured decades of hatred and abuse from the press and the public. She was called names that I won't repeat. Had her children harassed, had her privacy invaded in ways that would have destroyed lesser people. She paid a price for loving me that no one should have to pay. Anne turned from the window, her expression softening slightly. I'm not saying she didn't suffer. I'm not saying she's a bad person. But that doesn't change the fundamental fact that her presence in this family has always been divisive. It doesn't change the fact that there are people who will never accept her, no matter how many years pass or how well she performs her duties. People like you, Charles said quietly. The accusation hung between them, challenging Anne to deny it or own it completely. She chose neither, instead returning to her chair and picking up her teacup with steady hands. I treat Camilla with respect and courtesy, she said finally. I work with her when royal duties require it. I have never been openly hostile or deliberately cruel to her in public. But you're asking me to pretend to feel something I don't feel, to fake a warmth and acceptance that simply isn't there. I'm asking you to recognize that she is my wife and your queen consort, Charles replied. I'm asking you to show her the same loyalty you've always shown me. Anne's smile was sad and knowing. That's exactly the problem, Charles. My loyalty has always been to you, not to the women in your life. I supported you through your divorce, through the scandals, through the difficult years when your popularity was at its lowest point. I defended you when others in the family wanted to distance themselves from the controversy. I stood by you when you made the decision to marry Camilla, even though I had serious reservations. But you never truly accepted her, Charles said, understanding beginning to dawn. I accepted your choice, Anne corrected. There's a difference. I accepted that you loved her and that she made you happy. I accepted that she would become part of our public family, but I never pretended to welcome her into our private family with open arms. The distinction was important, Charles realized. Anne had fulfilled her obligations as a member of the royal family, had maintained the public facade of unity and acceptance, but she had never offered Camilla the genuine warmth and inclusion that would have made her truly feel like part of the family. The edited photograph was simply the most visible manifestation of an attitude that had persisted for years. The photograph, Charles said slowly, is your way of creating a version of our family that aligns with your true feelings rather than your public obligations. The photograph is honest, Anne replied. It shows the family as I see it, as I believe it truly is beneath all the protocol and public relations. It shows the people who have earned their place through blood, through sacrifice, through genuine love and loyalty that has been tested over decades. Charles felt a deep sadness settling over him. He had hoped that time would soften Anne's attitude toward Camilla, that the years of successful partnership and mutual respect would eventually bloom into genuine acceptance. Instead, he was learning that his sister's polite tolerance had always been exactly that, a performance for the sake of family unity rather than a genuine embrace of Camilla as one of their own. What happens now? He asked. Do you plan to continue displaying that photograph? Do you intend to distribute more copies to other family members? Anne considered the question carefully. I plan to keep the photograph where it is, she said finally. As for additional copies, that will depend on whether other family members request them. I won't force my perspective on anyone, but I won't hide it either. The conversation continued for another hour, covering decades of family history and personal grievances. Anne spoke about Diana's funeral, about the boys' grief, about the years when Charles's reputation was at its lowest point. Charles talked about his loneliness during his first marriage, about the love and support Camilla had provided during his darkest moments, about his hope that time would heal old wounds. Neither sibling changed their fundamental position during that conversation. Anne remained convinced that Camilla would always be an outsider who had disrupted their family's natural order. Charles remained determined to defend his wife's place in their lives and his conviction that love and commitment should matter more than past conflicts. As Charles prepared to leave, Anne walked him to his car. The autumn air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of dying leaves and the promise of winter. For a moment they stood together in comfortable silence, two aging siblings who had shared a lifetime of experiences and understood each other better than anyone else in the world. "I don't want this to come between us," Anne said finally. "You're my brother, and I love you. Nothing will ever change that." "But you won't change your position about Camilla," Charles replied. It wasn't really a question.
"No," Anne said simply.
"I won't." Charles drove away from Gatcombe Park with a heavy heart, knowing that the conversation had resolved nothing, and had perhaps made things worse. Anne's honesty, while painful, had at least clarified where she stood. There would be no sudden conversion, no moment of recognition that would lead to genuine acceptance of Camilla's family. The battle lines were drawn, and they were likely to remain in place for years to come. The real question now was what Charles would do with this knowledge and how far he was prepared to go to defend his wife's dignity and her place in their family. The edited photograph remained on display at Gatcombe Park, a permanent reminder of the divisions that protocol and politeness could mask but never truly heal. The following weeks passed in a strange sort of suspended animation, with both Charles and Camilla going through the motions of their royal duties while privately grappling with the implications of Anne's actions. The official schedule continued unchanged: state dinners, charity galas, meetings with foreign dignitaries, and the endless stream of engagements that defined their public lives. But beneath the surface, a fundamental shift had occurred in the family dynamic. Camilla found herself studying the faces of other royal family members during public events, wondering who had received copies of Anne's edited photograph and what they thought about it. She noticed subtle changes in behavior: a slightly cooler greeting from one of Anne's children, a moment of awkward silence when someone mentioned the Balmoral gathering, the way conversations sometimes stopped abruptly when she entered a room. The paranoia was exhausting. Camilla had spent decades building up emotional defenses against public criticism and media attacks, but this felt different. This was rejection from within the family itself, and it cut deeper than any newspaper headline or critical editorial ever could. She began second-guessing her interactions with family members, analyzing every conversation for hidden meanings and signs of alliance with Anne's perspective. Charles, meanwhile, struggled with his own demons. His relationship with Anne had always been one of the most important in his life. She had been his confidant during his darkest moments, his supporter when public opinion turned against him, and his strongest ally within the family structure. The thought of their relationship being permanently damaged over this issue was almost unbearable. Yet he also recognized that his response to Anne's actions would set a precedent for how Camilla would be treated by other family members going forward. If he allowed his sister to effectively erase his wife from family history without consequences, it would signal that such behavior was acceptable. Other family members might feel emboldened to express their own reservations about Camilla's place in the family. The decision crystallized during a particularly difficult evening when Camilla broke down completely. They had just returned from a state banquet where she had performed flawlessly, charming foreign dignitaries and handling her official duties with the grace and skill that had earned her grudging respect from even her harshest critics. But the effort of maintaining that perfect facade while dealing with Anne's rejection, Charles found her in her private sitting room, still wearing the elaborate gown and jewelry from the evening's event, but with tears streaming down her face. The sight of his usually composed wife in such distress affected him more deeply than any of Anne's arguments or justifications ever could. "I can't do this anymore," Camilla said through her tears. "I can't keep pretending that everything is fine when your own sister sees me as such an outsider that she literally removes me from family photographs. I've tried so hard, Charles. I've done everything that was asked of me. I've been patient and understanding and respectful, even when people were cruel to me. But it's never going to be enough, is it?" Charles sat beside her on the small sofa, taking her hands in his. The jewelry she wore, pieces that had belonged to previous queens, seemed to mock the security of her position. Titles and crowns couldn't protect against the kind of emotional assault that Anne had launched. "What do you want me to do?" he asked gently. "Tell me what would make this better." Camilla looked at him with eyes that had seen too much pain over too many years. "I want you to choose," she said simply. "I want you to decide whether I'm truly part of this family or whether I'm just someone you're married to who happens to carry out royal duties. Because I can't live in this limbo anymore, pretending that Anne's politeness is the same thing as acceptance." The request was simple in its directness, but complex in its implications. Charles realized that he had been trying to maintain peace by avoiding confrontation, by allowing Anne to maintain her position while expecting Camilla to simply endure it. He had hoped that time would soften his sister's attitude, but Anne's actions with the photograph had made it clear that her feelings were unlikely to change. That night, Charles made a series of phone calls that would reshape the family dynamic permanently. The first was to his private secretary, instructing him to arrange a formal family meeting at Windsor Castle. The second was to William, explaining the situation and asking for his support. The third was to Anne herself, informing her that her behavior had crossed a line and that there would be consequences. The family meeting took place on a gray Sunday afternoon in the Oak Room at Windsor Castle. The space had witnessed centuries of royal family gatherings, from celebrations to crises, and its formal atmosphere seemed appropriate for what Charles knew would be a defining moment in their modern history. Anne arrived precisely on time, dressed in her usual understated style and showing no signs of concern about the meeting she had been summoned to attend. William and Catherine came together, their expressions serious but supportive. Harry participated via video call from California, his presence on the screen a reminder of other family divisions that remained unresolved. Charles had prepared carefully for this meeting, consulting with constitutional experts and family advisors to ensure that his approach was both legally sound and practically effective. He understood that his actions would set precedents for future generations, and that the monarchy's stability depended on maintaining both family unity and clear lines of authority. "I've called this meeting," Charles began, "to address a situation that has become untenable. Anne, your decision to edit Camilla out of family photographs and to distribute those altered images represents a fundamental disrespect for my wife and for my position as head of this family." Anne's expression remained neutral, but Charles could see the slight tension in her shoulders that indicated she was preparing for battle. "I've already explained my position to you," she replied calmly. "I don't believe my actions require further justification." "Your explanations don't change the impact of your actions," Charles continued. "By creating and distributing altered photographs, you've not only insulted Camilla personally, but you've also undermined the public image of family unity that the monarchy requires. More importantly, you've forced me to choose between tolerating disrespect toward my wife and taking action to protect her dignity." William shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation, but understanding its necessity. "Perhaps we could find a way to resolve this privately," he suggested diplomatically. "Families have disagreements, but we've always found ways to work through them." "Some disagreements can be worked through," Charles replied. "Others require clear boundaries and consequences." Anne's actions weren't spontaneous or emotional. They were calculated and deliberate. She commissioned professional editing, had copies made, and distributed them to family members. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a systematic attempt to rewrite our family history. Anne finally spoke, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had never backed down from a fight. "I won't apologize for being honest about my feelings, or for creating a photograph that reflects my genuine perspective on our family composition. You can't force me to feel something I don't feel, Charles, no matter how much authority you think your crown gives you." The challenge was direct and unmistakable. Anne was testing whether Charles's loyalty to Camilla was stronger than his desire to maintain family harmony. She was forcing him to choose between his role as a loving brother and his role as a protective husband. Charles had anticipated this moment and had prepared his response carefully. "You're absolutely right that I can't force you to change your feelings," he said quietly. "But I can and will protect my wife from further humiliation. Anne, effective immediately, you are suspended from all royal duties for a period of 6 months. During that time, you will not represent the crown at any official functions. You will not attend family gatherings, and you will not participate in any activities that could be construed as royal business." The silence that followed was deafening. Anne's face showed the first crack in her composed facade, her eyes widening slightly as the implications of Charles's decision sank in. William and Catherine exchanged glances, clearly shocked by the severity of the punishment. Even Harry, watching from thousands of miles away, seemed stunned by his father's unprecedented action. "You're banishing me from the family?" Anne asked, her voice carefully controlled but carrying an undertone of disbelief. "I'm suspending you from royal duties," Charles corrected. "You remain my sister, and you remain a princess of the United Kingdom. But your actions have consequences, and those consequences must be proportional to the harm you've caused. If you can publicly edit my wife out of family photographs, then I can temporarily edit you out of royal functions." Anne stood slowly, her composure returning as she processed this new reality. "I see," she said simply. "And what are the conditions for the reinstatement of my duties?" Charles had hoped she would ask that question, as it offered a path forward that didn't require complete capitulation from either side. "The conditions are simple," he replied. "A public apology to Camilla for your actions, the removal of the altered photograph from display at Gatcombe Park, and a commitment to treat my wife with the respect that her position demands. Anne considered this for a long moment, her analytical mind undoubtedly weighing the costs and benefits of compliance versus continued resistance. The royal duties that Charles was suspending weren't just ceremonial obligations. They were a fundamental part of Anne's identity and her sense of purpose within the monarchy. "I need time to consider your terms," Anne said finally. "This conversation is clearly over." She walked toward the door with the same measured pace she had maintained throughout the meeting, but Charles could see the tension in her movements. At the doorway, she turned back to face the room one final time. "For what it's worth, Charles, I hope you understand that everything I've done has been motivated by my love for you and my concern for the future of this institution. I may disagree with your methods, but I've never questioned your right to make these decisions." After Anne left, the remaining family members sat in uncomfortable silence. The gravity of what had just occurred was still sinking in. Charles had taken an unprecedented step, one that would inevitably leak to the press and create new controversies for the monarchy to navigate. William was the first to speak. "That was necessary," he said quietly, "but it's going to be complicated to manage publicly." Charles nodded, already thinking about the media strategy that would be required. "Some things are more important than public relations," he replied. "Camilla has earned her place in this family, and I won't allow anyone to undermine that, regardless of their relationship to me." The meeting ended with tentative plans for managing the fallout and supporting Camilla through what would undoubtedly be a difficult period. But Charles felt a sense of relief for the first time in weeks. He had finally taken a stand, had finally prioritized his wife's dignity over his sister's feelings. The consequences would be significant, but the alternative, allowing Anne's behavior to continue unchecked, would have been worse. As the family members departed, Charles remained in the Oak Room, looking out at the grounds of Windsor Castle where centuries of royals had walked before him. He had made a decision that would define his reign and his family legacy. Only time would tell whether it had been the right choice, but he was certain it had been the necessary one. News of Anne's suspension from royal duties leaked to the press within 48 hours, despite the family's best efforts to control the information. The story broke simultaneously across multiple newspapers, suggesting that someone with direct knowledge of the family meeting had spoken to journalists. Charles suspected that Anne herself might have been the source, though he couldn't prove it and wouldn't have been entirely surprised if she had decided to control her own narrative. The headlines were predictably dramatic. "King banishes Princess Anne," screamed the front page of The Sun, while the Times took a more measured approach with "Princess Royal suspended from duties following family dispute." The Daily Mail, never one to miss an opportunity for speculation, ran with "the photograph that tore the royal family apart," accompanied by a 2-page spread analyzing every detail of the situation. What surprised Charles was the public reaction. He had expected widespread criticism of his decision to suspend his sister, particularly given Anne's popularity with the British people. The Princess Royal had always been seen as hardworking, no-nonsense, and dedicated to her royal duties. Her suspension seemed likely to generate sympathy and anger directed at both Charles and Camilla. Instead, the response was more nuanced than anyone in the palace had anticipated. While some commentators criticized Charles for what they saw as an overreaction to a family dispute, others praised him for defending his wife against what they characterized as bullying behavior. Social media was particularly active with debates about family loyalty, respect for marriage, and the complexities of modern royal relationships. A significant portion of the commentary focused on the technical aspects of photo editing and the implications of digitally altering family history. Several technology experts were quoted explaining how sophisticated such alterations have become and questioning whether other royal photographs might have been similarly manipulated over the years. The story took on a life of its own, expanding beyond the immediate family drama to broader questions about authenticity and truth in the digital age. Camilla found herself in the unexpected position of receiving public support from quarters that had previously been critical of her role in the royal family. Several prominent feminists wrote articles defending her right to be included in family photographs and criticizing what they saw as an attempt to erase her contributions to the monarchy. Younger commentators, particularly those active on social media platforms, seemed especially supportive of Charles's decision to defend his wife. However, the situation also created new challenges for the royal family's public relations team. Every public appearance was now scrutinized for signs of tension or division. When Charles and Camilla attended a charity gala without Anne, journalists noted her absence prominently. When William appeared at an event solo, speculation arose about whether he was distancing himself from his father's decision. The pressure was particularly intense for other members of the royal family who were forced to navigate questions about their positions on the dispute. Edward and Sophie, Anne's younger brother and sister-in-law, found themselves in an especially difficult position. They had maintained good relationships with both Anne and Camilla, and their diplomatic responses to media questions were carefully parsed for hidden meanings. Anne herself remained largely silent during the first week following her suspension, leading to wild speculation about her emotional state and her plans for responding to Charles's ultimatum. She was photographed continuing her normal routine at Gackham Park, working with her horses and managing her estate, but she declined all interview requests and issued no public statements. The silence was broken when Anne agreed to participate in a carefully orchestrated interview with a respected royal correspondent from the BBC. The interview, conducted in the familiar surroundings of her estate, was Anne at her most controlled and articulate. She appeared calm and thoughtful, dressed in her typical country attire, and spoke with the measured tones of someone who had given considerable thought to her words. "I want to be very clear about something," she said during the interview. "My actions were not motivated by personal animosity toward Camilla, or by any desire to cause pain to my family. They were motivated by my understanding of what our family represents and my commitment to maintaining the integrity of that representation." When pressed about the photograph and her decision to edit Camilla out of it, Anne was characteristically direct. "I created a photograph that reflected my perspective on our family composition at that particular moment. Some people might see that as cruel or exclusionary. I saw it as honest. I've spent my entire adult life in service to the crown, and I've learned that sometimes truth is more important than comfort." The interviewer asked whether she regretted her actions, and Anne's response was measured but uncompromising. "I regret that my actions caused distress to people I care about. I regret that a private family matter has become a public spectacle, but I don't regret standing up for my convictions or expressing my honest feelings about complex family dynamics." Perhaps most significantly, Anne addressed Charles's ultimatum directly. "My brother has asked me to apologize, to remove the photograph from display, and to commit to treating Camilla with what he considers appropriate respect. I understand why he's made these requests, and I understand that my response will determine my future role in royal life." The interview concluded without Anne definitively accepting or rejecting Charles's terms, but her tone suggested that she was still considering her options. The lack of resolution only intensified media speculation and public interest in the story. Behind the scenes, other family members were working to find a compromise that might allow both siblings to save face while resolving the underlying conflict. William, in particular, had taken on the role of mediator, conducting separate conversations with both his father and his aunt to explore possible middle ground. Catherine, drawing on her experience as someone who had married into the royal family from the outside, had several private conversations with Camilla about the challenges of finding acceptance within the institution. These discussions helped Camilla process her feelings about Anne's rejection, while also preparing her for the possibility that some family members might never fully embrace her. The international press had also picked up the story, with newspapers and broadcast outlets around the world analyzing the implications of the royal family dispute. Some foreign commentators expressed puzzlement at what they saw as a typically British obsession with protocol and tradition, while others used the situation to examine their own national monarchies and family dynamics. The story took an unexpected turn when several historical photographs of previous royal generations surfaced, some of which appeared to have been similarly altered or carefully composed to exclude certain family members. Royal historians began examining decades of official family portraits, looking for evidence of other instances where inconvenient relatives had been edited out of the official record. One particularly striking discovery was a series of photographs from the 1930s that had been altered to remove references to Edward VIII. The parallels to Anne's actions were not lost on commentators, who noted that the royal family had a long history of revising its visual narrative to match changing political and personal circumstances. As the second week of Anne's suspension began, pressure mounted on both siblings to find a resolution. The ongoing uncertainty was affecting the monarchy's ability to focus on its core functions, and there were growing concerns about the long-term impact on public perception of the institution. Charles found himself in regular consultation with constitutional experts and senior advisors about the precedents his actions might establish. The suspension of a senior royal family member was virtually unprecedented in modern times, and there were legitimate questions about the legal and practical implications of his decision. Camilla, meanwhile, was dealing with her own complex emotions about the situation. While she appreciated Charles's support and his willingness to defend her dignity, she was also aware that his actions had created new tensions and divisions within the family. She began to question whether her presence in the royal family was worth the ongoing conflict it seemed to generate. The weight of public attention was also taking its toll. Every public appearance required careful consideration of how her behavior might be interpreted, and the constant scrutiny was exhausting. She had endured decades of media attention, But this felt different because it involved family relationships rather than just public perception. During a private dinner at Clarence's house, Camilla raised the possibility of stepping back from her royal duties to reduce the pressure on the family. "Perhaps Anne is right," she said quietly. "Perhaps my presence in this family creates more problems than it solves. Maybe it would be better for everyone if I withdrew from public life." Charles's response was immediate and forceful. "Absolutely not," he said. "You have every right to be here, every right to be part of this family, and every right to be treated with dignity and respect. Anne's feelings about the situation don't change those fundamental facts." The conversation continued late into the evening, with both of them exploring the possible consequences of different courses of action. By the end of the night, they had reaffirmed their commitment to weathering the crisis together, regardless of the personal cost. As the story continued to dominate headlines, it became clear that the situation would not simply fade away with time. A resolution would require one or both of the siblings to make significant concessions, and the nature of those concessions would shape the royal family's dynamics for years to come. The photograph that had started it all remained on display at Gatcombe Park, a physical reminder of the philosophical divide that had torn the family apart. Visitors to Anne's estate could still see it in its prominent position, and some had begun making pilgrimages specifically to view the controversial image. The media attention had transformed a private family dispute into a public debate about respect, loyalty, and the nature of modern marriage. The resolution, when it came, would need to address not only the immediate family dynamics, but also the broader questions that the controversy had raised about the role of the monarchy in contemporary British society. 3 weeks into Anne's suspension, an unexpected catalyst emerged that would force both siblings toward a resolution they might not have reached on their own. The catalyst came in the form of Queen Elizabeth II's personal diary, discovered by archivists working in the Royal Archives at Windsor Castle. The diary entry, dated just months before her death, contained observations about her family that would profoundly impact the current crisis. The discovery was made by Dr. Margaret Thornfield, a respected royal historian who had been granted access to previously sealed documents for an official biography project. Among the papers she was reviewing was a leather-bound journal containing the late Queen's private thoughts about family matters during her final years. One entry, written in Elizabeth's distinctive handwriting, addressed the very issues that were now tearing her children apart. The relevant passage read, "I have watched with concern as old wounds within our family refuse to heal. Anne carries burdens from the difficult years that I perhaps should have helped her process more thoroughly. Her loyalty to Charles during the divorce was admirable, but it may have prevented her from accepting the healing that time should have brought. Camilla has proven herself to be a woman of remarkable strength and dignity, far more than many gave her credit for in the early years. He has made Charles happy in ways that I had feared might never be possible after the pain of his first marriage. If I have learned anything in my many years as queen and as a mother, it is that holding on to past grievances serves no one and heals nothing. When I am gone, I hope my children will find the wisdom to choose love over resentment, forgiveness over judgment." Dr. Thornfield faced an ethical dilemma upon discovering this entry. The contents were clearly private family matters, but they also provided crucial context for understanding the current crisis. After consulting with senior palace officials and receiving approval from Charles himself, she made the decision to share the relevant portions with the royal family. The impact on both Charles and Anne was immediate and profound. For Charles, reading his mother's words about Camilla provided validation that he hadn't realized he needed. Elizabeth had rarely expressed her personal feelings about family matters during her lifetime, and her written acknowledgement of Camilla's worth and Charles's happiness was deeply moving. For Anne, the diary entry was more challenging to process. Her mother's gentle criticism of her inability to let go of past grievances was difficult to read, particularly because she recognized the truth in it. Elizabeth had always been diplomatic in her approach to family conflicts, but her private thoughts revealed a more direct assessment of the situation than she had ever expressed verbally. The timing of the discovery seemed almost providential. Charles had been struggling with doubts about whether his suspension of Anne was the right approach, while Anne had been wrestling with her own conscience about the photograph and its implications. Their mother's words from beyond the grave offered both criticism and guidance that neither sibling could easily dismiss. Charles made the decision to share the diary entry with Anne directly, arranging to meet her at the private chapel at Windsor Castle, where their mother's funeral service had been held. The location was deliberately chosen for its symbolic significance and its capacity to remind both of them of larger perspectives beyond their immediate conflict. Anne arrived at the chapel dressed in dark, formal attire that seemed appropriate for the gravity of the meeting. She had clearly been affected by reading their mother's words, and her usual composed demeanor showed signs of strain. Charles waited for her in one of the front pews, the diary entry printed on a single sheet of paper beside him. "I've read it," Anne said simply as she took a seat beside her brother. "Several times, actually." They sat in silence for several minutes, both contemplating the words of a woman who had guided their family through decades of challenges and changes. The chapel was quiet except for the distant sounds of Windsor Castle's daily operations, creating an atmosphere conducive to honest reflection. "She was right about me carrying burdens," Anne said finally. "I've held on to resentments and judgments that I should have released years ago. The divorce, the scandals, the way our family was portrayed in the media during those years. I never properly processed my anger about all of that." Charles nodded, understanding more clearly than ever before how the traumatic events of the 1990s had affected his sister. "You were protecting me," he said quietly. "You were defending the family when everything seemed to be falling apart. That loyalty meant everything to me. But I can see now how it may have prevented you from accepting the healing that came afterward." Anne turned to look at the altar where so many royal ceremonies had taken place over the centuries. "I think I convinced myself that accepting Camilla would somehow be betraying Diana's memory or minimizing the pain that period caused all of us. But that was never really what this was about, was it?" "What do you think it was about?" Charles asked, genuinely curious to hear his sister's analysis of her own motivations. Anne was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Control, perhaps. Or fear. For so many years, I felt like I was helping to hold our family together during incredibly difficult circumstances. When you and Camilla found happiness together, part of me felt like my role as your protector was no longer needed. Maybe editing that photograph was my way of asserting that I still had some control over how our family story was told." The admission was remarkable coming from Anne, who rarely engaged in such psychological analysis of her own behavior. Charles could see how much courage it had taken for her to reach this level of self-awareness, and he felt a surge of the old affection that had characterized their relationship for most of their lives. "The suspension," Charles said carefully, "was my way of trying to protect Camilla the same way you tried to protect me all those years ago. But I think we've both learned that protection can sometimes become control, and control can sometimes cause more harm than the threats we're trying to defend against." They talked for over an hour in the quiet chapel, working through decades of accumulated misunderstandings and unspoken resentments. The conversation was sometimes difficult, with both siblings acknowledging mistakes and admitting to motivations they weren't proud of. But it was also healing in ways that surprised both of them. The resolution they reached wasn't a complete capitulation by either side. Anne agreed to remove the edited photograph from public display at Gatcombe Park, but she would keep a private copy as a reminder of her own journey toward understanding. She would also issue a public apology to Camilla, but one that acknowledged the complexity of their relationship rather than simply dismissing her previous actions as completely wrong. Charles, for his part, agreed to lift Anne's suspension from royal duties, recognizing that the punishment had served its purpose in forcing a conversation that might not have happened otherwise. More importantly, he committed to regular family meetings where such issues could be addressed before they escalated to crisis levels. The public resolution came in the form of a carefully crafted joint statement, released by Buckingham Palace 3 days after the chapel meeting. The statement acknowledged that there had been differences of perspective within the royal family regarding family relationships and personal boundaries. It announced that these differences had been discussed openly and honestly, and that all parties were committed to moving forward with mutual respect and understanding. Anne's public apology to Camilla was delivered during a family event at Buckingham Palace, witnessed by other royal family members and palace staff. The apology was genuine but measured, acknowledging that her actions had caused pain while also explaining her motivations in a way that provided context without excusing the behavior. "Camilla," Anne said in front of the assembled family, "I want to apologize for editing that photograph and for the pain that action caused you. My behavior was inappropriate and disrespectful, regardless of my personal feelings or motivations. You have earned your place in this family through years of dedicated service and unwavering support for my brother. I may not always understand or appreciate the complexities of our family relationships, but that doesn't excuse treating you in a manner that was beneath the dignity you deserve." Camilla's response was gracious and measured. She accepted the apology while acknowledging that relationships within any family, particularly one as complex as theirs, required ongoing work and patience from all parties. She expressed hope that they could continue building understanding and mutual respect over time. The edited photograph was quietly removed from display at Gatcombe Park and replaced with a different family picture from the same gathering, one that had not been altered and showed all family members present during the original moment. Anne kept her word about maintaining a private copy, but it was stored in her personal study rather than displayed publicly. The media response to the resolution was generally positive, with most commentators praising both siblings for finding a mature way to address their differences. Some critics suggested that the entire controversy had been manufactured for publicity purposes, but most observers recognized the genuine family dynamics that had been at play. More importantly, the resolution seemed to mark a genuine turning point in the relationship between Anne and Camilla. While they would likely never be close friends, they developed a working relationship based on mutual respect and shared commitment to supporting Charles and the monarchy. Their interactions at subsequent public events were noticeably warmer, and several observers noted moments of genuine conversation and even humor between them. The crisis also led to broader changes in how the royal family handled internal conflicts. The regular family meetings that Charles had proposed became a formal part of their governance structure, providing a forum for addressing concerns before they escalated to public disputes. The meetings were facilitated by a neutral family counselor who specialized in high-profile family dynamics. 6 months after the photograph controversy began, Charles and Camilla hosted a private dinner at Clarence's house for close family members. Anne was among the guests, and she brought with her a new photograph from a recent family gathering, one that prominently featured Camilla and had been taken with Anne's personal camera. She presented it to Camilla as a gesture of goodwill and genuine acceptance. The photograph showed the entire extended family during a relaxed afternoon at Sandringham. Charles and Camilla sat together on a garden bench, surrounded by children and grandchildren. Anne stood behind them with her hand resting gently on Camilla's shoulder, a mirror image of the protective gesture she had shown toward Charles in the original controversial photograph. "I thought you might like to have this," Anne said as she handed the framed picture to Camilla. "It shows our family as it actually is, not as I thought it should be." Camilla accepted the gift with tears in her eyes, understanding the significance of the gesture. The woman who had once edited her out of family history was now deliberately including her in it, creating a visual record of acceptance and belonging that had been absent for so many years. The evening was a success, with family members genuinely enjoying each other's company without the underlying tensions that had characterized such gatherings for years. As guests prepared to leave, Anne approached Charles privately to thank him for forcing the conversation that had led to this healing. "You were right to suspend me," she said quietly. "I needed to understand the consequences of my actions, and I needed to be forced to examine my own motivations. It wasn't pleasant, but it was necessary." Charles embraced his sister, feeling the return of the close bond that had sustained them both through so many challenges over the years. "We're family," he said simply. "That means we fight sometimes, but we also find ways to heal and move forward together." The story of the edited photograph became part of royal family lore, a reminder of how personal relationships could be complicated by history, expectations, and the unique pressures of public life. But it also became a story of redemption and growth, showing how even deep-seated conflicts could be resolved through honest communication and mutual respect. Years later, when royal biographers would write about this period in the monarchy's history, they would note how a single photograph had exposed fundamental truths about family dynamics, personal growth, and the ongoing evolution of the British royal family. The crisis had been painful for all involved, but the resolution had ultimately strengthened both individual relationships and the institutional stability of the monarchy itself. The photograph that Anne had given to Camilla remained prominently displayed in their private quarters at Clarence's house, a daily reminder that families could overcome even their most difficult challenges when love and commitment proved stronger than pride and resentment. In the end, it wasn't the edited photograph that told the true story of their family. It was the one that showed them all together, imperfect but united, facing the future as one.